joining us this morning. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be featuring this latest body of work by Portland artist Elizabeth Malaska. This is our second solo exhibition with Elizabeth, and I'm just blown away by this work. Elizabeth was actually born and raised here in Portland. She received a BFA from the California College of the Arts and then went on to earn a master's in visual studies from the Pacific Northwest College of Art. And she's been actively exhibiting her work for about 15 years now. In addition to maintaining a very rigorous studio practice, Elizabeth has taught at the Oregon College of Art and Craft, as well as at PNCA, and she's also served as a mentor for PNCA's MFA program. She's received multiple grants throughout the course of her career from both the Oregon Arts Commission and the Regional Arts and Culture Council, and in 2018 alone, she was the recipient of 3 very prestigious awards. She was named a Hallie Ford Fellow in the Visual Arts. She received an Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation grant, and she also received a Joan Mitchell Foundation grant. So thrilled about that. Elizabeth's work is in the permanent collection of the Portland Art Museum, as well as in the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer collection, and a major painting was recently acquired by the Schneider Art Museum at Southern Oregon University down in Ashland. And this next year, she is going to be honored with solo exhibitions at the Los Angeles Valley College, as well as at the Schneider Museum of Art. So I am so proud to represent her, happy to have her here this morning. After Elizabeth speaks about her own show, she is going to take us upstairs and talk briefly about the exhibition upstairs, Drinking the Reflection, which she curated. And I'm also very pleased to say that one of the artists included in that show, Mira Day, is also here this morning, and so she'll speak with us about her work. So please welcome Elizabeth Malaska.
Thank you, Martha, for that introduction, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I have to say that I have a very sick kiddo at home, and my sleep this week has been quite poor, and I am now sick myself. So I have provided myself with a little security blanket of notes for myself because my brain is not quite functioning at optimum capacity. But here I am. And thank you all for being here. I want to start out speaking about my work by telling you a story. And this is an old story, and it is a version of a much older story. This story comes from Sumeria, and it is about 5,000 years old, but the story itself, the ancestry of the story is much older. So once upon a time, there was Inanna, queen of heaven, and Inanna had a sister, Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal had a lover and he died. And so Ereshkigal followed her lover to the underworld, and Inanna followed Ereshkigal because Ereshkigal was her sister and because she wanted to pay tribute to the dead. And when Ereshkigal heard that Inanna was coming, she had the 7 gates to the underworld closed, so that when Inanna came to each gate, she had to pay passage. And so she paid with what she had. She gave her crown and her jewels and her clothing and her name and her power. And so that when she arrived at the center of the underworld, she was naked and nameless and powerless. And there Ereshkigal pinned the eye of death on Inanna, and Inanna died. And Ereshkigal hung her corpse on a meat hook, and she hung there as rotting flesh for 3 days. Now, back in heaven, Inanna had a friend, Ninshabur, and she had said to her friend, as one does, "Hey, I'm going to go do this thing. If I don't return, can you come look for me?" And Inanna didn't return. And Ninshabur started asking for help. And finally, Enki, Inanna's father, sent 2 of his androgynous demon helpers called Galas to the underworld. And they came to the center of the underworld, and there they found Ereshkigal, and she was giving birth. And there they found Inanna's body, and they took that rotting corpse off of the meat hook, and they traveled with it back through the 7 gates. And as they passed each gate, the thing that Inanna had relinquished was returned to her. So she regained her name and her power and her clothing and her finery and her crown. And she was returned to her place as Queen of Heaven. But there is always a price, and the price that Inanna chose to pay for regaining her position as Queen of Heaven was the life of her husband, Dumuzi. So she sacrificed the life of her husband so that she could maintain her position. This story is about a lot of things, but one thing that scholars agree that it is about, and I think anybody could understand, you don't have to be a scholar, is it is about the moon. It's about the moon starting out as round and full and waning and disappearing until it's gone for 3 days. It's dead to the night sky. And then it returns as a tiny baby and grows to regain its power until it once again is the full round queen of the night sky. And if we look at imagery of Inanna from this time, from Sumeria about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, we see Inanna with the body of a human, a beautiful face. She has wings of a bird. She has a crown on her head. She has taloned feet of a bird, and those feet rest on lions, 2 lions, and those lions are resting on a mountain. And the lions are flanked by 2 owls. And if we look at the imagery, we can see the ancestry of that imagery. Lions and birds are going back to the first depictions of form that we have from humans in the Paleolithic. We have lions and birds as symbols and consorts of a central, powerful, feminine deity. And moving forward, owls from Neolithic times forward are symbols of that feminine deity's immortal presence in the world. So the imagery links the story to much older stories. And Sumeria is a really interesting place. In terms of where it is, it lies in what's called the Fertile Crescent, which is in present-day Iraq. And because of its location, that area, and trade routes and movements of people, that area received a lot of legacies of cultures that came before it. And it, because of its vibrancy, influenced many, many cultures that came after it. So Babylonian, Assyrian, Greek, and Roman onto Judaic and Christian cultures. And of course, our culture as part of that lineage. Now, I know I'm starting out talking about a story and telling you a story, but I get asked about this a lot about my work. What's the story of this piece? I don't think of my work as a story, as stories. I think about my work much more akin to poetry. And of course, poetry and stories are very related, but very different as well. Poetry has a very different relationship to time than most stories. Poetry is often compressed. And I don't just mean that poems can be short, although they can be, but the energy of them is like the Big Bang, like all things sort of contained in this very tiny thing that has the potential to explode. And poetry takes emotional logic over a kind of analytical logic as a greater authority. Poet Ada Limon says that, let's see if I can remember this correctly. Poetry creates space for unsolvable things, which I love. And so if I think of my work as poetry, the reason that I'm talking about a story right now is because this work really started out with thinking about stories, thinking about these old stories and the older stories that fed in to those stories, and how stories, really I think of stories as creating the culture that we live in. We continue to live by stories, and they also create our own relationships to our lives. So they create our experience on a very broad and a very individual level. And thinking about these ancient stories, like for example, the story of Inanna that I just told you, if we look at that story, what do we see? We see a central figure that is female, that is in the position of, making decisions about what she does. And we also see there's a really interesting relationship between life and death in that story. Life and death are partners in a way. There's not a kind of hierarchical or malicious relationship between life and death. Ereshkigal and Inanna are sisters, and they act, if not in partnership, because Ereshkigal shut the doors to the seven gates to the underworld, but there wasn't a sense of maliciousness in that action. So there's a reciprocal relationship between life and death. But stories change over time, and stories change in relation to the needs and desires and goals of a culture. And Sumeria 5,000 years ago is a really interesting point in terms of human history. We have a real kind of sea change at that point, which of course is slow because things move slowly, but a real sea change in the stories that are being told. A movement from stories with a female figure as protagonist, or even like a female figure seen as kind of the mover and shaker of the world, if you will, to and also an interrelationship between life and death on a level playing field, and a kind of a belief in the cyclical nature. Things go away, but they return again. There's a big shift in those kinds of stories, and we get ascendancy of a central male figure or protagonist, mover and shaker, and we get a sense of a hierarchy between above and below, between life and death, between good and bad, and that those forces are at war with each other rather than in partnership with each other. For example, if you look at the story of Persephone from a little bit after this story, you have the same basic outline. Woman goes under the ground, goes to the land of the dead, and returns, but it's so different. She is, Persephone is the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of abundance in the harvest, and we're talking about Greek culture here. And she's picking flowers gaily in the meadow, and all of a sudden the earth opens up. This black, terrifying mouth opens, and out of that mouth rushes Hades in this, very aggressive way, and kidnaps her and drags her down to the underworld. And she's forced to stay there against her will, and she's tricked to returning. She eats 3 pomegranate seeds. And because of those 3 pomegranate seeds that she ate, she must return 3 months out of the year. And those are the months that we experience as winter, because Demeter, her mother, during those 3 months mourns the loss of her daughter. And so because she is mourning that loss, the earth becomes barren. and death isn't a time of renewal or the period before the rebirth. It's a time of nothingness, of loss. So how these stories move and how elements of them remain and yet get twisted and twist us in the process was really the starting point of this work, and the through line for me in this work. And I will also say that in terms of the distortion of the bodies, which you'll see, as another through line through the work, I've often thought about that distortion of the bodies as related to my own personal experience, an event happening in the past, and looking at it through the span of time, and that distance, performing a kind of stretching of the bodies that gets expressed, a stretching of the psyche, but in the painting it gets expressed as a stretching of the body. But I think in thinking about stories, it also is about the distortion of the bodies is also about how we as individuals and collectively as a culture get distorted as some of the figures in these stories may get suppressed or repressed. So I want to talk a little bit about how I make the work. And the work moves through three distinct stages. I start with image collecting, and I'm always collecting images. I'm sort of in the final stage of image collecting for my next body of work right now. And the image collecting is happening all the time, and that creates what I think of as a kind of compost heap, and that exists in reality in my studio as big, huge piles of papers that I'm constantly sifting through. But it also is kind of sifting through my mind. And as that compost heap is, steaming and percolating, and the microbes are sort of like making, inroads through there, certain images will rise up to the surface, and those images start to coalesce in very intuitive ways. Things seem to go next to each other, and as that grouping happens, I start drawing, and that's the second phase of making the work for me. And the drawing, every phase change is a change of materials, and it means a change in how my body relates to the making, and consequently how my mind relates to the making too, and my experience. So moving into the drawing is a really interesting time. Things move very quickly. I draw with vine charcoal, which is super soft, and can make a kind of a hard line, or you can turn it on its side and it can make a really wide line. And it also seems to want to move like this too. And so that engenders kind of its own life. And people say that writing is akin to drawing. I've heard artists say that. And I would agree with that, although I would say drawing is akin to free writing for me. It's not linear, but it's quick, and it's very associative, and it's a very playful space. And so the drawings can go through sometimes a few or sometimes many iterations. And then I'm looking for a place where the image lands. And again, this is a very kind of felt sense in my body. It kind of comes to a stillness. And I know, okay, there's something here that's working compositionally, value-wise, content-wise. And then that drawing becomes a skeleton for the painting. And as I move into the painting, that material shift engenders, again, a very different relationship to the making. If drawing is like, I would think of drawing as like walking. And painting is like swimming. It's moving through a substance that resists has a certain kind of resistance. I mean, air has a resistance, but water is thicker and it has greater resistance. And there's also there's a depth to it, which lends it a kind of slowness. Like if you move your hand through the air like that, you can move it at a certain speed, but if you try to move it through water, there's a drag on it. And paint is slippery and it's smushy and it's drippy and it's it has that kind of resistance. And I think its qualities, its physical qualities, lend themselves to different states of mind. So you'll notice in my work that a really strong component is a kind of collision of different elements, which sometimes appears as collage. And collage is definitely, I think a lot about collage. I use collage in the process of making. I think of like putting those different found imagery together as a kind of collage. And the history of collage too is really something I think about a lot. Collage is is a tool that has been used, a tool of resistance that has been used throughout 20th and 20th century art and writing. So collage and thinking about collage and colliding things together drives my work. Back to that quote from Ada Limon, where she says poetry creates a space for unsolvable things. I think that when collage does that too, when I bring two things together that don't necessarily belong together or may like resist each other, initially it can create unforeseen opportunities or possibilities. I think also that term, a space for unsolvable things, I think about that it reads in two ways for me. When you create a space for unsolvable things, one, what you're doing is you are holding the hope of the possibility that solutions may arise. And I don't know about you, but I constantly, I feel every moment of my day, like the world is filled with unsolvable things and it feels like it's accelerating the unsolvability of things. So I'm desperate for a sense of possibility that things could be okay. So even the glimmer of a hope of, something shifting does something for me. And then also to create a space for unsolvable things is to be honest with ourselves, with oneself, and be like, oh yeah, things are really screwed up. And even just acknowledging that is a kind of there's so much dishonesty. On the wider scale and also on an individual scale. It's a struggle to be honest with oneself, and it's a struggle to find honesty in the world today. And so to have that moment where you acknowledge the truth of what is and that it may be unsolvable, that in itself can create space that then maybe new possibilities can happen in. So this bringing together of these radically different elements in my work, it's these things about collage. It's also materiality. I use acrylic paint, a certain kind of acrylic paint called flash, which is I use that because it's very, very matte. And I can control it to a high degree. I also run the matte through an airbrush, which is a new tool for me with this work. And then oil paint. And those two, the flash and the oil paint it's like skiing versus driving a Porsche or something like that. It's just like this very things that are super different. And again, they're coming together and they're talking about failure, and they're talking about possibility, and they're talking about unsolvability. And they're also talking about a kind of magic too, because these spaces, these things actually can coexist together, even though they in actuality couldn't, but there's a kind of reality that's created in these spaces where I get to imagine and project things that I want. I also get sort of like subjugated where things I don't want happen. The last thing I'll say about this collision of things, and this is indebted to my friend Mario, who said this, he said that my work is really anti-fascist, and I loved that because, and I agree with him in that this collision of these very disparate things is a resistance against fixed meaning. If a meaning is fixed, then it becomes propaganda, and what I am attempting to do is to create a space where the meaning is shifting as I'm making it, the meaning is shifting as you're looking at it, the meaning is shifting over time, and that is essentially an anti-authoritarian gesture. The last thing I'll say is I was speaking with a group of PNCA students this week, and one of the students asked a question and said something that I really loved, which was he asked about the accessories of daily life in my work. And that's definitely kind of a new element that I've worked with this body of work. And it arose very organically. Actually, the first instance that arose is in this piece behind us called It's Our Pleasure to Serve You. And it was the solo cup, the red cup on the black table there. And that arose out of my work and my learning with how to use the airbrush. And the airbrush as it's this touchless spray, this superfine spray of paint it is so far, in my experience, really well suited to making things that are very shiny or like molded plastic, which is very, very, very hard to paint with a brush because molded plastic doesn't want to have like brush marks on it, So it was kind of, that solo cup was actually like really a revelation for me. I was like, oh. And that even just the juxtaposition of that, like a piece of trash being revelatory for me in the making is emblematic of, I think, what I'm talking about in terms of the collision and collage of meaning and materials in my work. But yes, absolutely. I'm pulling in these accessories of daily life, and many of them are actually accessories of my daily life. But I don't do it as a gesture of self-portraiture by any means. Neo Rausch, the great painter Neo Rausch, says that painting is like mining sediments of the past in a trance-like state. And I love that idea of sediments because, and I think of this actually in terms of dust bunnies. Like we're constantly shedding, skin and hair, and those parts of ourselves float around in the air for a while, and then they coalesce in still places in our lives, under the bed or under the couch. And then you open the front door, and a gust of wind comes in, and it blows this thing out from under the bed, and it's small, it's made of us. But yet it has a little bit of monstrosity to it. It's like the return of the real, it's like, this is you. And that is also part of the gesture of these accessories of daily life. And it's also an assertion for me that, back to this idea of stories, the stories, the paintings are a kind of living, mercurial thing. They're not fixed in time. And in terms of time, these accessories like a PlayStation controller or a cough syrup bottle or a takeaway cup or a solo cup or a plate of sushi or a cell phone charger, they locate the work here and now, but also because of the kind of expansive the expansive nature of some of the other signifiers in the work, or the fact that, say the TV screen is turned away from us so we can't read what's on it, or, there might be like a reference to a Judy Chicago painting, something that, or a telephone that is, not of, this decade. There's indicators that the paintings are also taking place in other times and in other eras. And so, yes, the paintings are happening now, but there's also a sense that they're always happening too. So, and that's where I'm going to stop. And I hope I haven't gone over time, and I'm happy to take some questions if we have time.
A couple questions, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether you should devote all your energy to painting. You'd be a wonderful writer. So I understand the fusion in your mind, the two skills. And I'm interested in your collection of images. You have this huge bank of images that have to separate themselves into paintings. I find in writing, in which I do the same thing, that when things separate, there's a unifying principle in the paragraph or the painting. So, like, what would be the unifying principle of this?
I think you're absolutely right in a unifying principle. I think essentially what you're asking me is to tell the story of this painting, which I could, but I'm always very hesitant to tell the story, because it's my story of the painting. It's not your story of the painting or their story of the painting. And yes, absolutely, the artist's relationship to the work is important, but it doesn't stop there. And I worry about my own interpretation eclipsing somebody else's interpretation. Also, I'd have to think about that for a while to answer it, because this painting I finished 6 months ago, and so I'm as you're asking me, I'm kind of excavating the imagery that was the genesis point for the drawings. And thinking through the things that changed in the drawing. Yeah, that's my non-answer answer. Thank you. Yeah.
So one thing that's always, provided sort of this abrasion, in your work for me is the contrast of edges. And so I was wondering why and how and what materials you use lend best to different types of edges. Like, what do you use for masking, if you do, because I think you probably do. And then why do you contrast edges, and why are the human forms a little bit less, or like the alive forms less edgy?
So why the edges and how the edges, basically, is what you're asking. I'm always looking to create tension in my work, and I create tension through the things that come together in the image, but also tension is created in the movement from one kind of mark making to another. And and edges, I think, are a really potent place, like where one draws an edge, philosophically, and how that can be depicted through figurative painting. Like in this piece, there's a really strong edge, say, between her leg and the mirror here. But there isn't really a strong edge between her body and the bathtub, And so where that, and the edge, when things have a sharp edge, it's kind of like, it's just like a very strong contrast. It's like drinking coffee and then, eating a cherry or something, or something even stronger than that, like drinking coffee and eating a hot pepper, a pickled jalapeno or something, And so it's, the edges are sometimes very emphasized and in other places very de-emphasized, often sort of in inappropriate places, because a body is very different than a bathtub, but when the body and the bathtub are sort of merged into one or sort of flirt with merging, then that creates another kind of edge because you're coming up against the edge in your mind that is expecting porcelain and flesh to be very different. Mm-hmm. So the edges happen visually, but they also happen perceptually, I think, in the places where we expect them to be, and then they're not. And that really goes back to my interest in challenging the gaze, in being aware of what our expectations are for what we see and how can I thwart expectations as a way to kind of like bring awareness to the act of looking. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of how I do it, yes, I definitely mask. I'm very... and for masking, we can, if you're a painter, I'd be happy to tell you more technical information. Might not be interesting to everybody, but I'd be happy to share with you. And I used to mask and use an X-Acto knife, but I've stopped doing that because it leaves a tiny little cut on the surface that I don't like. And then I'm very, very strategic about what goes down when. And so, because I try to mask as little as possible because it's very, very time consuming. So, yeah.
I was really struck by your description of collage as being inherently anti-fascist. I'm interested in considering that. And I feel like to some extent that's baked into art since postmodernism, right? That everything is radically open to interpretation. We're undermining capital T truth and stuff. But it feels like to invoke anti-fascism in a moment of like global ascendant fascism necessitates some kind of like materialistic praxis. So I'm wondering for you, like, does that gesture that happens for you in your work, does that bleed out into some sort of praxis, or is that not the job of art? Like, what is your relationship with it?
Oh boy. I try to do, I'm highly aware of my position as an artist as, I spend all of this time alone in my studio on things that, it doesn't necessarily like put food in anyone's mouth or like heal, sick children. And I am a highly fallible human being. I'm just, thinking about like my relationship to my family and my child. And it's a question I struggle with a lot. And I invoke my friend, Sarah Centillis, who talks about art and artists as, in this time when everything feels like it's so pressurized and we have to do something now to fix everything, because things are so fucked up. And Sarah talks about the gesture of art making is the belief that something can come from nothing or something can change radically. It's that imaginative gesture is really the gesture to remake the world, and that in itself is super powerful. And I feel utterly compelled to make paintings. Like to your comment, I could never be a writer because I would be tortured always that I wasn't making paintings in the studio. So I just keep trying to make the best paintings I can and be a good parent and a good person. And I feel like if I can get 5 hours of sleep a night on top of that.
Thank you very much.